Well, I want to welcome everybody to another Fireside Adoptees, Adoptee Fire series, speaker series on interviews. So we're very happy to hear today from Steve Mark, who's got a really compelling story and almost one that's the intensity of which, as I read bits of it, were emotionally overwhelming for me. I just want to read a little bit about Steve's bio, and then I would like if he could share uh, a special comment that he wrote that I read as part of the information I was using to prepare for the interview, which is his own words about what the beginning of his experience as an adoptee was. So let me tell you a little bit about Steve. He was part of Operation Babylift and adopted on April 24th, 1975, one of 4 children on the last commercial PanAM flight out of Vietnam before the Fall of Saigon. So Steve will speak about that in a moment. He was adopted to Vancouver, British Columbia, in Canada, the youngest of 4 siblings. Due to his adoption, his mom was involved in volunteer work, helping other families navigate the adoption process. When Steve was in 9th grade, his mom founded the Adoptive Families Association of British Columbia, which is still in existence today. Steve grew up attending many adoption-related functions, including sitting on panels to speak about his experience. And lately, he's been very interested in connecting with fellow adoptees and hearing all the diverse stories. Steve recently took his family back to Vietnam to visit his birth country. So welcome to Fireside Adoptees, Steve. Thanks for being here.
Great. Thank you very much, Greg. I'm happy to be here and yeah, share my story with fellow adoptees.
Thank you. Again, you can hear a little tremble in my voice as I read about part of your story that I know. And you presented to me a graphic. It was an image of a PanAM airliner, and your words blazoned across it. And I wonder if you could read what you had written so people could get a sense of that impact.
Sure. Yeah, and I have it up. So those aren't my words, but these are the words out of a book that Rosemary Taylor wrote. And
Okay.
she was an Australian sister nun that was very integral in many adoptees for Operation Babylift. So it's part of this book. But I'll read it. April 24th, 1975, 4 children were escorted by John Carr SJ on the last PanAM flight to leave Saigon. John had been a strong and silent support over the past hectic months. He reported later, fighter jets were swooping in low around the field, firing their weapons. 450 persons were on board, far over capacity, including Saigon PanAM staff. The baggage men jumped into the baggage holds and closed the doors behind them. And then I added, I was one of those 4 children. So in this book that my mom has is like sort of in the written beside the paragraph is Steve was one of those kids. So yeah, that's how I came to sort of become adopted to Canada. But before that, and maybe let's give a bit of background.
Sure.
Of course, like many parents or adults or everyone at that time was conscious of the Vietnam War and what was going on for several years. So my parents, wanted to do something to help out all these orphans of the Vietnam War, and so they started that long process, the long adoption process. And I don't know actually how many years it was, but on April 4th, they got maybe a call or a letter. I don't know how they would have communicated back then, obviously not email. They got a note saying that I was on that C5A plane that crashed on April 4th. And I'm not sure if there's any other Vietnamese adoptees on it, but as part of Operation Babylift, a big US airplane, the C5A, upon takeoff crashed, and many of the people on board died. And so that was the communication that my mom and dad got at the beginning of April. And then April 28th, they got a call that I was in San Francisco. So my mom would have got the call at home. My dad was at work. He was in court. He's a lawyer. So of course there's no calling him or contacting him. So at that point, I have 3 older siblings, and I don't think they were in school yet. My sisters are 5 years older, and my brother's 2 years older. So the story, and I've heard the story many times, but I think my mom would have had to drop my siblings off at a friend's house, potentially go to the bank or borrow money. Of course, pre-cell phone, pre-ATM, jump on a plane to San Francisco. And then by the time she got back to YVR or Vancouver, my dad met us right at the airport. So he would have had this message at his office, coming out of court, thinking that, this devastating news that I was on that flight on April 4th. So I wasn't coming to Canada. And then he would have got the note saying, my mom went to San Francisco. I'm, quick trip back. I think it's maybe like an hour or two flight from Vancouver to San Francisco. So my mom went and came back before my dad got out of work.
So they had probably been really heartbroken and thought you were gone. And then suddenly this news came that you were on the other plane. You were on this last plane out of Saigon, or before Saigon.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
how old would you have been at that time, Steve, when you were adopted?
So I came in April 75, and like many adoptees of the Vietnam War, our documentation, there's sort of contradictory documentation. Like I have a couple different birth dates. I have a passport with 2 pictures, but even like I was a few months old, the pictures and the names are different, and you can definitely tell it's not the same baby. So I have 2 different names as well as 2 different birth dates, and I don't know how like immigration decided to go with one or the other, but I went with November 12th, but I also had October 5th. So only a month difference, but different names and different pictures. And yeah, at the time they were just trying to get babies out of Vietnam before it fell to the north.
Yeah. As you got older, did the fact of the ambiguity of your identity ever present problems with being a person in Canada? Any residency problems or anything?
Not really, because I don't know how they did it. Like immigration just chose that one set of documentation, and then we went with that.
Does it leave you feeling like, I know for some adoptees who have questions about birth date, particularly intercountry adoptees who are really up against this barrier of knowing for sure how old they are when their birthday was, but did it ever present you with any feelings of, wow, who am I really, or what is this really like for me? Was it ever a source of contention for you in terms of your self-understanding?
No, not really. I think it was unique. It was more of a mystery, which I kind of embraced.
Yeah. Any idea about the other children on that last flight out? Do you know what happened to them?
No, I don't. And like I'm involved in a bunch of different like Facebook groups, different adoptees Facebook groups, some just for Vietnam. And I know there is one for PanAM. And I did message because I think that pilot has done a lot of work with the adoptive community because, he was obviously all the staff were such a huge link in that whole Operation Babylift chain. But I sent him a note and I don't think I've heard back from him yet.
So I'm wondering about when you came into so you came into Canada, and obviously everything, let's say you were very young, obviously at that time. So everything
Yeah.
you probably remember growing up has been being someone who grew up in Canada. Was there a time in your life or a certain age where you suddenly thought or gradually had an awareness that everything was different for you than the people you were growing up with?
Oh, for sure. And my parents, like, I've listened to lots of different interviews, adoptees, but my parents were really always wanted me to sort of embrace my Vietnamese culture, but did it sort of at age appropriate stages, right? Like, obviously when I would have gotten to the age, I don't know how old, maybe 2 or 3, or maybe younger. Of course, I don't look like my siblings. Like I was adopted into a Caucasian family. I have my brother's like 18 months, 2 years older than me. And then I have 2 twin sisters who are 5 years older. So yeah, at whatever point they would have had the discussion with me, but probably several times, as I got older, and they'd explain more as I, could sort of ingest that information.
Yeah. So obviously there's no way for transracial adoptees, for example, to fit in context. So I often hear that the awareness is just always before you, meaning there's nowhere really to hide from. It's just always part of your awareness. So sometimes we talk about the adoption fog, and a lot of a lot of intercountry adoptees say, no, that was never something I had because I was always fully aware of being an adopted person and the impact of what that meant for me. It sounds like your parents did a great job of wanting you to stay connected or establish some connection to the Vietnamese community. Was that a community in your vicinity at all, that place available to you to be able to connect like that?
Not really with other Vietnamese, but like my mom, because like as you sort of mentioned in the intro, she was very involved with volunteering to try to help other families navigate the process because it is so convoluted. And then of course she went on to fund the organization. But we kept in touch with Rosemary Taylor for years. Like in the beginning, we'd like, exchange Christmas letters. And then even when I went back to Vietnam by myself, actually not by myself, but with my girlfriend at the time during university. And I miss Rosemary Taylor in Thailand by like a week. She's from Australia. But my adoptive parents came, like I took 4 months off and did, the normal like Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia. But my parents met us in Vietnam, and we for the month, because the visas were a month back then, we travel with them, but we sort of meet up in different spots in Vietnam. But we arranged, like my mom had it all arranged to go to the orphanage. And so we took a bunch of like children's supplies, school supplies. So we were pretty connected then.
So that is where your origins were then, meaning that was where you were taken out of in order to go on the airliner, was out of an orphanage,
Yeah, it was Phu Mai Orphanage in Saigon.
and it's still there. Wow. What was it? What
Yeah.
was it like to be there, to see it?
Well, back in 1997, it was pretty intense. At that point, it was all, or for the majority, was special needs, like young, you're not young, but children with special needs. So yeah, of course, it was hard to go back. And then we kind of had an interpreter, and there was someone else there. Like we were there, I think, most of the day. But I did just go back when I took my family back last year at spring break, but I didn't call or do anything in advance. So we just kind of showed up, and they told us to come back later. So we did, and then we came across another sister or nun who didn't remember me, but she was there when I was there back in 1975. And through Google Translate, and interestingly enough, because of her age, she spoke French, and both my kids are in French immersion. So it was actually my daughter who sort of did a lot of the translating. And of course, it wasn't perfect, but sort of high level conversation. So that was really interesting to go back after 30 years.
Sure. I'm really interested in what you said here about language. Real quick, I wanted to ask you about something I often hear is a connection that the intercountry adoptees feel to places they came from, that when they visit for the first time, almost like a transcendental experience of this is the land. This is what it was like maybe when people were treading on this land, and now I'm here. Did you have any experience of being in Vietnam that was similar to that?
For sure, both in 1997 and then just in earlier or last in 2023. But I think more in 1997, it was like seeing kids or seeing people on the street, or like just like out on the street or living on the street, thinking, that could have been me,
Mm.
right? And it was interesting because I haven't been back since 1997 till last year. And of course, you see stuff on social media and all the tourist sites. Things have obviously really changed, but I didn't see that same kind of poverty that I saw back in the 90s when Vietnam was just opening up.
Yeah, that must have been a really marked difference to see how it, I don't know if progress is the right word, but definitely development in ways maybe that were beneficial for people in terms of economic status or material status. Maybe they were better provided for or finding better opportunities.
Yeah, and it was interesting because a lot of people like on both trips, they knew I was Vietnamese, but they knew I wasn't from Vietnam or like currently living in Vietnam.
Yeah.
So
How,
yeah, and there's a term, it's called Viet Q. It's kind of like Vietnamese people who leave and then come back. And I don't know if it's still derogatory, but it was back then in the 90s, and I sort of got called out all the time. But I don't that might have changed now. And I didn't get that as much when I was back just last year.
so this led partly to the question I was going to ask about language, because that wasn't the language you grew up with, did you find that you had an interest in learning the language, and did it present any challenges to try to do that, or have you tried to do that?
I haven't really tried to do that. And like I said, both in 1997 and when we were back with the older generation, I could get away with a bit of French.
Yeah, okay.
But I think it's a very hard language to learn.
Do you have any feelings about the fact that there's this obviously a whole culture and all the language and everything intact, and does it ever feel like there's an outsideness to it, that you're kind of looking inward at it, and does it create any sense in you about belonging or longing for a deeper connection with it, or do you find that this is good, this is fine the way this is going?
Yeah, there's sort of there's a not a longing to belong, but I'm just fascinated. Like with my family, I've traveled quite a bit in Europe and like did bike trip in New Zealand, but Vietnam, because it's Vietnam, it's been my favorite trip for sure because of that. And even back in 1997, where I did Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, because it was Vietnam and because there's those roots, it was just so much more impactful and meaningful.
Any any thought of for most adoptees, there are obviously thoughts of search and reunion. I know that's not an option for, fortunately, a lot of people who've gone through intercountry adoptions. Did you ever have any desire to connect with actual family members in Vietnam, or have any chance to do that, or know how you would go about doing that?
Back before DNA testing, corresponding with Rosemary Taylor, and I think I was probably heavily corresponding with her before I went back, like during university, and she basically said it's a needle in a haystack.
What I thought.
But I did do a DNA search. Sort of, it's kind of convoluted, and this may take us on a tangent, but I did find a DNA match, but not what I thought.
Oh,
Do you want me to go into it?
sure, please do. Thank you.
Okay, so this will sort of take a different tangent, but it's all tied to adoption. So before COVID, one of my sisters, a Caucasian, she did her degree in biology, so super interested in genetics, family trees, that kind of stuff. Always has been. She, by accident, or so she claimed, she ordered 2 DNA kits. And she's like, "Oh, you got to do one, you got to take it home, do it, see if there's any relatives in Vietnam." So again, this is before COVID. So I took it home, probably sat on my dresser for 6 months, finally did it, got the results back, and found some real remote connections. Kind of forgot about it, and I sent some messages, 6/8 cousin, didn't hear much back. Then just last year, about a year ago, I'm sitting working at home, a message on Facebook Messenger. "Hello, this is going to be alarming to you. My name is Chris. It says you're my dad." And I was like, "What? This can't be." All I said is, "How old are you?" And he said he was 27. I'm like, 27? So for context, I'm 49 now. I'm like, I'm trying to do the math. I'm like, I was in second year university. I think the test must be wrong. And then what he said is, "Well, you're not the only person I'm related to in the DNA test or in Ancestry." And then he mentioned an ex-girlfriend I had back from university. So I'm like, "Can I call you?" And he's like, "No, I can't, because I'm down in Brazil. I recently got married. We just had a kid. My wife's Brazilian, and we're down here for 3 months introducing our new baby to her side of the family, cousins, parents, brothers." So I'm like, "Well, give me a sec. I got to check on this, right?" So I messaged my ex-girlfriend on Facebook saying, "Hey, can you give me a call? It's important." Half an hour later, she calls back, and I explained what's going on. And I said, "This is going to sound weird, but did you have a kid without telling me?" And she said, "No." I'm like, "Okay, well, I've got this kid down in Brazil. I don't know what to think. Maybe it's a scam." So I said, "Well, it's good to chat with you. Sorry to bother you. Yeah, I got to get back to this kid." I messaged the kid back saying, "Hey, man, I don't know what you're talking about. I talked to my ex-girlfriend of like 30 years or more, like, and she said no, so I don't know what to tell you." Half an hour later, I get a call back. She's in tears. I can barely understand her. Right after we broke up, she went out on a date, was sexually assaulted, went through with the pregnancy, went through with the adoption, didn't tell anyone. So for 27 years, she's had this secret of that there's a kid maybe out there, but as a result of this sexual assault. But of course it wasn't, it was ours. So it's just like a total different loop of adoption. But so we grew up on the mainland in Vancouver. I live in Victoria on Vancouver Island. And get this, he was raised in the same city and until recently lived here. So up until he just had a kid, he lived in the same city as me.
Oh,
And then
wow.
when he found out the only reason I was in Ancestry because I was adopted, it blew his mind. Because if anyone can understand growing up and not knowing your genetics or your heritage, it was me. And my ex, for whatever reason, gave false information at the hospital. So his adoptive parents could never track down um, a birth mother. So he grew up his whole life, his identity was not knowing his genetic background. And the reason he did it was because now once him and his wife had a kid, they wanted to sort of give their son a background story. So yeah, so a totally different adoption story. When I tell people this, everyone thinks, oh, I found a relative in Vietnam, or maybe there's a cousin who got adopted to the States, or some of the boat families moved over to the States, or Australia, or Europe. But no, so that's another part of the adoption story,
Yeah.
which is like it's kind of baffling. But yeah, now I'm a grandpa and I have a grandson, and I'm about to have another granddaughter like in a couple weeks.
Oh, congratulations on that. And I imagine that, uh, I hope that the fact that you could understand that as somebody who had that sense of unrootedness in terms of your knowing about yourself, that it allowed you to hopefully have a connection to him, that he could feel that, yeah, this person understands me. And obviously he was looking to connect and said, oh, this may sound wild to you, but I think you're my father. That must have been really astonishing for you.
It was. I just got back. I don't know if you know where Edmonton is, but I just got back from Edmonton this weekend. I went and visited them and then met his adoptive parents for the first time and learned their story that led up to them adopting. So they were it was on the cusp of his dad turning 40, because after 40, because they'd done the home study and they were waiting to get a child, they were saying if we don't get a child by 40 or before his dad turned 40, we're not going to bother. And he turned 40 on November 9th, and Chris went to that family in October. So yeah, crazy story.
Yeah, and the proximity piece too. So many adoptees have
Yeah.
proximity stories growing up right right with somebody they didn't even know they were next to, pretty much, and they were related to. I have those stories, and I know so many others who do. That must have been really, really remarkable for you. But congratulations on your grandchildren as well. And it sounds like hopefully the connection is pretty strong. That's kind of nice to hear. So thanks for sharing that. I appreciate it. And it is all connected
Yeah.
to the adoptee story, the things that we can experience here, and the diversity of it. How about finding, since you said in the culture that which you grew up, that was not that you saw a lot of Vietnamese people around you, but at some point, I know that you've made connections in the community as a Vietnamese adoptee. How did you
Yeah.
start making those connections, and what has that been like for you?
Oh, it's been amazing. Like there was a couple local or BC adoptive groups, and like one of the women who launched it several years ago, and it's gone through several iterations. I don't know if you know Leah Kim Brighton. I think she's
Oh,
attends quite a few of these things. I think
yeah.
she has ICAV Canada. I'm not sure. There's so many different or adoptee Asian adoptees of Canada. Anyways, she was adopted and grew up in White Rock as well. So I knew her. She's quite a few years younger. So at that early age, you don't really socialize. But I think she's 7 years younger. But so I've been involved in some local groups. But for the most part, it seems like they're Korean adoptees. But I guess through Facebook, and I don't even know how I found the group. I'm involved in a few just Vietnamese adoptees, and then the work the Sea to Coast Foundation that like Rachel Galvez and Mike Ander that they're doing. So I've done just a podcast with them. but and I've listened to like, like you record these sessions. I've listened to about 12 or 13 interviews and it's just for Vietnamese adoptees, but I find them so interesting. It's just this like global network now because of social media that we're finding these huge connections and so many things resonate and there's so many similarities, but there's also so many differences. So it's just been in the last year or so, I'm just fascinated about all these different stories and this commonality of adoption. But yeah, it's just amazing.
And of course, our friend Linnell down in Australia,
Yes, for sure.
she was excited to hear that we're coming on, and we've had some interviews with her as well, and important work she's doing with ICAV, and she was excited to hear that about your story coming on here. So you your reputation is out there, and I was so happy you agreed to the interview when I first started talking with you. Like, so this, and I wouldn't have known at that point how extensive your involvement might be or how much your story might be out there. So I appreciate that you were open to sharing that. And it's certainly a very enlightening experience to hear from these perspectives, especially when you think about the historic significance of a country like Vietnam, and very much on the entire global scene, and being a war-ravaged country. And you've talked about the reconstruction a bit there, the building up again that's happened even since your first trip compared to your second trip into the country. And do you have any plans to return again in the future?
Yeah, because it's going to be the 50th anniversary of Operation Babylift. So that's just next April. So if I can swing it, I'm gonna go. And I've talked to like some of the folks like Rachel and Michael about going. Like there's a whole I'm actually gonna be on a Zoom call, I think in a couple of weeks, about there's a whole bunch of people organizing like a huge trip, like with I can't imagine the coordination. I'd like to go, maybe go to a few dinners. I don't need to do like the full tour, but I would definitely love to go meet up with fellow adoptees and then kind of do my own thing, like probably with my wife.
Yeah,
But like my wife and I are definitely talking about it when we retire. I'd love to go in like not just Vietnam, but like go live in Vietnam for 3 months, right? Or then maybe go to France, but like definitely go to Vietnam and travel around, but like use maybe Hanoi or Hoi An as a home base and just live. I think it would be amazing.
that's really incredible. I hope you get that opportunity to do that. And
Yeah.
do you feel like with your own children that there's an importance for them to understand their heritage as well through? Because I know, like for me, I mean, I struggle. I think my children don't have a real sense of any of my heritage, and I'm wondering if you've had any more success or fortune of being able to help them understand more about themselves.
Yeah, and I think like we went when we went, my kids were in grade 11 and grade 9, but originally we were supposed to go March 2020, but of course of COVID. And in hindsight, I think waiting those few years in terms of their age and their understanding worked out better in the end. So yeah, and I like, and because I'm always talking about, they're probably sick about it now, but because I'm in all these groups and I'll come off a Zoom call and I'll be like, oh my gosh, you should hear this story. I think maybe they're being not inundated with it, but they're definitely aware of it, and it's part of their heritage. And then now, the son I just realized I had a year ago, it's part of his heritage too. So it's
Yeah,
very unique. And my wife's Indo-Canadian, right? So we were supposed to go to India this spring break, but we're not. But so they have a very unique story, my kids.
great that you're able to help them stay connected that, or to sense what the connection might be that way. I do think
Yeah.
topic I see coming up a lot more is this discussion of parenting as being an adoptee. And part of that, I don't want to use the word obligation here. Part of the sense of that is helping your children understand. And I think that it's easy, at least for me, like I was trying to describe, it was hard to pass along any interest to my kids that I came from somewhere and that they had a heritage. They're just kind of they couldn't feel it, I guess. And I understand that. And I wish I'd had a way to inculcate that deeper. I'm really glad that there's a chance for you to do that. And I feel like it's really important to the degree that we can do that, that we help our kids feel that connection too. So otherwise they grow up kind of truncated as well and don't have a deep sense of identity from that perspective. I'm not saying they may struggle with existential identity, but in terms of heritage and culture and a national pride for where they may have come from, that I think can be something that's difficult to instill when you're discovering it for yourself.
For sure, for sure. Yeah, I'm discovering it thanks to all these different stories and our experience, and then, yeah, as my kids do, and as they, get more mature, get out of high school, if they go, go to university, all that kind of stuff. And I'm assuming now that they've got that sort of travel bug, 'cause we've done quite a bit of travel, I'm sure they'll go back to Vietnam at some point. Maybe we'll meet them there, or even better, they go on their own, they go with friends, like in their 20s, right? Like the normal travel stuff.
They would feel that connection enough actually to make that journey themselves too. Wow.
Oh, I think so.
Discussion, and I haven't had that discussion with anybody I've interviewed before in terms of this, so that's really meaningful for me. I want to thank you for that. And I was wondering, so you're in the community with Vietnamese adoptees, and you're also here in this more diverse setting of, we have domestic adoptees, we have all kinds of international adoptees, but and I feel like there's a place for everybody to fit into these communities. Have you noticed that when you go into a larger, meaning a broader setting of different types of cultures and maybe even a lot of domestic adoptees, that the experience of relating is a little different? Or do you feel like there's a commonality in a way between all different kinds of adoptees, even if it's just something very fundamental?
Well, I think obviously there's a commonality that we were all adopted under, completely diverse circumstance, but we all, like, I think I've seen, like, there's a ton of memes out there, but someone shared what, like, adoption is like having the first page of your book ripped out because there's that mystery, right? To varying degrees. And there's also that thought of I probably saw it like on one of Linnell's pages, but like adoption starts with loss, like straight out the gate starts with loss, right? For the birth mother, for the birth family, totally different circumstances. As the adoptee gets older, there's that loss or that potential feeling of loss and abandonment, right? So that's that commonality. And I like doing both, like just the Vietnamese Facebook groups or interactions, but also like the diversity of any adoptees, international, domestic, and even growing up, a lot of it was, well, it was a mix between international and domestic adoptees, like all these like conferences and panels that I'd sit on. And then through my mom's work, my dad's law firm started focusing a lot on adoption, both international and domestic. So they specialize. So I was still even sort of more exposed to it in terms of hearing my dad, of course you can't talk about details, but just I was sort of very immersed in it growing up until I left to go to university.
I'm real curious here as we get near the end. Could you talk a little bit about the panels? What sorts of things did they want to talk with you about it in the panels you were on?
Just a lot, like what was your experience growing up? Did you experience racism? What did you feel different, from your siblings? Were you welcome into your community? Was it different for you to, join friend groups or sport teams, that kind of stuff, right? Because it for the most part, it was parents who were going through that home study process, and they wanted to see, like, what is it like for different kids at different ages, and right. So, and of course everyone had a different story. Some kids didn't have very good experiences, some had good, like a total mixed bag, but those what most of the panels were like. And I forget how many I did over the years at different ages, like high school, and I actually think I did some in university as well for my mom.
Yeah, I think that providing that perspective, that of your own experience, is really valuable for anybody to hear. And
Yeah.
I'm interested in whether specifically adoptees, like, did you find that you were on a panel with a lot of other adoptees, or was it like, I'm the only adoptee on this panel and we're talking about? I'm just wondering what the extensiveness was of the extent of what these panels were like for you.
Oh, no, it was all adoptees.
Okay,
Like, I think so. So these parents who are about to adopt or in the process wanted to see what the experience was like, right? Like, if they adopt a child from, domestic, international, what are some potential issues or hurdles or experiences that their kids may come across as being an adoptee?
let's end with this real quick conversation. I know it's a very big one. For somebody who does grow up as inter-country adoptee and is presenting with a completely different set of challenges, they're not the same race, or they don't resemble their family. What would you say for somebody who's struggling to, I don't even know if I want to use the words fit in, because that sounds like there's a burden on somebody, like I've got to adapt myself to this. But what kind of encouragement would you offer to inter-country adoptees who may be struggling?
I would almost say, not fit in, but just, and it's different with everyone, but to embrace your uniqueness. And that's one thing my parents always promoted. Like, even when I was little, and of course, I'm sure the story's been embellished, but like, I was so proud that I had been on a plane before any of my siblings because I came on a plane, right? Like, my siblings came out of my mom, but I came on a 747 or whatever that PanAM jet is. So,
Yeah,
but of course, not all adoptive parents want to promote it. I've been on many calls where they don't want to talk about it, right? But I was just very fortunate, and I know there's a lot of narrative about like how adoptive kids or adoptive people are saved, and maybe that's not the case. But in my example or my instance, I felt like I was given a great opportunity. So I always sort of went through life, and all the credit goes to my parents in terms of kind of building that up, building that uniqueness and that interesting story up, and always promoting it. So it was never trying to sort of fit in, because I grew up in well, it was sort of white rock, and it was very Caucasian white dominated. There wasn't very many Asian kids or any other ethnicities, right? So when I was Asian, but I didn't come from, a full Vietnamese family, but I embrace the uniqueness. So that would be my only advice, but that's not all, I understand that that's not always the case in terms of growing up in a very supportive environment.
that's great that you have that. I feel like even as a domestic adoptee, I can relate to the idea of being able to express and embrace being unique, because every one of us didn't, we stood out in ways that because we were from somewhere else, and that was
Yeah.
not often acknowledged for a lot of us. And so, even though I certainly wouldn't equate it to the degree of distancing that you would have experienced in your particular situation, and inter-country adoptees would experience, but I do sense something of that in terms of how it felt to be told growing up, we never saw you any differently. We never thought of you any differently.
Yeah.
You're just the same. And I remember how that felt to me, like, well, but I'm not. Maybe we can just accept that I do have real differences, and maybe I can embrace those too. And so can my parents. So
Yeah. Yeah. They didn't treat me any differently in the negative, but they treated me differently in the positive to go and do that research and embrace your culture. Like, one last thing before we go
sure.
open it up. My mom sent me to this, like, I'm not sure if you're from Whistler, the big ski mountain in BC.
Okay.
So my mom sent me to Whistler Summer Ski Camp when I was in grade like 5 or 6, or maybe I went through maybe 4 or 5, 6. And I thought it was amazing because I grew up skiing, and I got to go and ski on a glacier in the summer and then do a bunch of summer activities. But the reason she did it was there's this freestyle skier named Wayne Wong. He wasn't even Vietnamese, but my mom wanted for me to have an Asian role model. So all along, I thought it was just this awesome opportunity to go to a ski camp when I was, in elementary school. But my mom she was wise. She had the bigger picture of me identifying with a role model who looked like me and just happened to be a world-class freestyle skier.
That's, I think that's a real good way to do that. So I'm glad you had that experience as well.
Yeah.
And I want to thank you very much for your candor and sharing your story, Steve. There are so many things that I'm going to take away from having listened to you and heard about the things that you've gone through in your life and the way you've been able to go and reconnect with some things and part of your past was really compelling. So I want to thank you again for coming to Fireside, for being a member of Fireside, and we see you in the calls and appreciate your attendance there. But thank you again for this opportunity to speak with you.
Yeah, my pleasure. And thanks for having me, and thanks for listening.
Thank you. So for everybody who's watching right now, we're going to conclude the recording section here, which is the Zoom call will continue, but you'll hear an announcement that the recorded portion is about to end, and then we'll move on to Q&A. But everybody can find the interview on Fireside Adoptees YouTube channel with other interviews we've done with great adoptees, and we hope to see you there. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.